Hello and welcome to another panel. This panel is really significant in terms of timing because we are in the summer season and we will discuss Russian aggression on Ukraine, Russia-Ukraine war, and we will see exactly what's going on over there, the impacts, perceptions, and projections with really distinguished guests. And, I want to introduce them, though. First, I want to tell you why we have selected such a theme on this month. The first of all, as you know, once a crisis erupts, the concern of yesterday will be the history of today. And just remember the Syria crisis, it started in 2011. Now it has been marginalized, even though there's a continuous engagement of parties. Sometimes Russian and American aircrafts are just having dogfights like UAVs, but we are not talking about it. On the other hand, Ukraine is a bit different if compared to the other regions. In Ukraine, well, two states challenged each other. Actually, Russia challenged Ukraine, though, currently on the battlefield. Two states are challenging each other in a conventional way, and there's a potential of unconventionality. On the other hand, it's just at the backyard of Europe. I don't think that there's no backyard for any state because we are a globe. So each country does have a front. In this sense, Ukraine reminds exactly the First and Second World Wars and potential of an additional circulation in terms of, tensions, political challenges, and military escalations. And this war reminded us visiting the old words and concepts, especially for academics. We were discussing the validity of geopolitics, and still we see that, well, it's valid because geopolitics is at hand. Balance of power is at hand. I don't want to be a pure classical realist, though. It's a fact that we recalled and reminded exactly the concepts of the Cold War era with a new interpretation. In this sense, I believe, Russia and Ukraine war, well, we have to discuss it. We have to abstract lessons and see projections, understand projections. I mean, not only explaining it, but also understanding it is really important, especially for such sort of wars. So for this purpose, we have invited four distinguished scholars, think tankers, and thinkers from first Ukraine, Ms. Dr. Yevgeniya Gaber. He is a foreign policy expert, non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council in Turkey, and also a member of the Center in Modern Turkish Studies, Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. He was once a diplomat, worked in Ankara, and he had the opportunity to mix experience, profession with theory. So please welcome Dr. Yevgeniya Gaber. Our second panelist is from Turkey, Atılım University. Well, she's an associate professor, and her master's degree was at Moscow State Institute of International Relations, which is really a precise one, and PhD at Bilkent University. And her focus is actually Russian, Ottoman, and Balkans history, together with international politics. She prefers a mixture of them. And one article was really interesting. It was about Ukrainian identity, which was drafted in 2018 or 19. And finally, we have Associate Professor Antonia Colibășanu. She is a senior geopolitical analyst and chief operating officer at Geopolitical Futures. She has a great book, which was published in 2022, Geoeconomic Roundabout. And she deals with geopolitics and has an affiliation with Romania National University of Political Studies and Public Administration, and also associate senior expert with the New Strategy Center in Bucharest. And also she worked for Stratfor for more than 10 years. Welcome, Professor. And we will have Professor Yücel Acer, once rector of Turkish 18 March University, currently teaching in Yılıdırm Beyazıt University as Professor of International Law. And he's an expert of maritime delimitation and issues, especially in terms of law, on sea. So we have a great panelist community right now. And I believe that the discussions will be more than Ukraine, actually, because we will touch geopolitics in this panel. For your, by your permission, I would like to first ask a question to Ms. Dr. Yevgeniya Gaber, because currently she is in Odessa. Odessa is heavily bombed by the Russians, by missiles, especially last week or after the termination of the grain deal. We know that. And there is a great catastrophe over there. On the other hand, we have to understand what's going on the front in terms of military. And we have to unite this perception, this assessment with economy and politics, because the dynamics on Ukraine is really a lot. Once we talk about grain deal, it's not only permitting the passage of the vessels, but it's about politics. It's about mediation. It's about a win-win situation during the war by combatants. It's something different in this war. So, Dr. Gaber, what do you expect, especially for the future of war, and how do you assess the current developments, either military, politics, or economy? Doesn't matter, with an integrated approach, just to obstruct a projection. Mm-hmm. And the word is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And indeed, thank you for the invitation. I appreciate this opportunity. And it's really nice to have colleagues from Turkey, from Romania, because I think now what the Russian war in Ukraine made it clear is that whatever happens in the Black Sea is not about the Black Sea. Whatever happens in Ukraine is not about Ukraine, it's about all our countries. And I think we'll talk about this, about maritime security, about what is going on in the Black Sea Basin, what is going on with the grain deal. That's where Ukraine, Romania, Turkey have a lot to do together. So really thankful for this opportunity. Now coming to the situation in Odessa, I have to tell you that only this morning I've been in my basement 2 times because of the mix, which occasionally take off somewhere in Belarus or in Russia. So it's really tense, and the last weeks were really tough with the bombings of the historic city center and of the especially seaport infrastructure facilities, agricultural facilities in the southern region of Ukraine. So that's, I would say, a new level of this war. But then it's also important to understand that this full-scale invasion, it did not start actually invasion itself started in February 2022. But Russian new attacks on Ukraine after 2014 started back in 2018 with the so-called Kerch incident, with the construction of illegal Kerch Bridge or Crimea Bridge, it's called sometimes, and with the seizure of Ukrainian vessels. So for us, those were the first signs that Russia is also trying to impose this blockade of Ukrainian seaports, major seaports, like, for example, Berdyansk or other ports on the Sea of Azov, and that at some point of time, it would try to do the same in the Black Sea. And that's what we saw in 2022, and that's what we have to do to deal with now. It's both Russian aggression on land and the Russian attempts to have this blockade of Ukrainian seaports on sea, including the termination or actually quitting of its part of the Grain Sea deal. So what's going on in the front line is obviously, I would say, stalled Ukrainian counteroffensive in a way that everyone was expecting it to be much faster. And many people were thinking of it as a breakthrough like we had in Kharkiv and Kherson, for example, before, right, with the occupation of Kiev. It did not happen for several reasons. One, because the battlefield is heavily mined. So one of the major problems that Ukraine has now is dealing with the heavily mined battlefield, which narrows the possibility and the capability for maneuvering on the battlefield. Of course, this is also the timing of this counteroffensive. Russians had several months to dig in, so the engineering constructions they are much better prepared than the ones that we saw in Kherson and Kharkiv, for example. And of course, lack of air support, both in terms of F-16s, for example. That's not only issue for Turkey but also for Ukraine as well. But air defense systems, because any counteroffensive has to have this air support, and because there is lack of air defense systems which are combined generally with counteroffensive on land, that's also what makes it quite difficult for Ukrainians, because when you have this narrow corridor in between mines and you have to advance, you only can move if you have this kind of shield from the air. So altogether brings us to the point where Ukraine does have some incremental advances. So here and there, now mainly focusing on Tokmak direction, that's the western part of Donetsk region and partially Zaporizhia region. So it's going on every single day. We have some news from the front line, but of course that's not this major kind of breakthrough. And what I have to tell here as well is that Ukrainians are still talking about the sentiments in Ukrainian society. They are still determined to move on and to carry on this counteroffensive. So there is no this war fatigue in Ukrainian society. I would say there is no this desire to have compromises with Russia, to freeze the conflict, because there is the realization that though it's tough, it's the only moment now when Ukraine has a chance to deoccupy its territories. And also because of the attacks on the civilians, that's another major part. Combined with this is attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure. That's another major thing. Now we're talking about Russian attacks on seaport infrastructure, but also logistical chains and also Danube ports. Why? Because after quitting the grain deal, what Russia tried to do is first, of course, to cause major damage and major destruction to Ukrainian agricultural facilities. So the first attacks were mainly on grain silos, terminals, and up to now, just after mid-July, when Russia withdrew from the grain deal, 180,000 tons of grain, including corn, including wheat and different other types, were destroyed just within these attacks. Then there were these attacks on seaport infrastructure, so that Ukrainian seaports of Odessa region would not be able to handle cargo and actually to accept vessels. And then because we started thinking of alternative ways of how to still ship the grain and send it to the Middle East, to the global south, to other countries, mainly Ukraine was thinking of switching to the ports of Danube. So that's how the attack on Reni came, for example. And Reni is another small city in the southern part of the Odessa region, so that that's a very clear strategy and tactics of the Russian Federation now, both to try to dominate the Black Sea and in a way to occupy partially the Black Sea, so kind of decide who is coming in and who is not leaving the Black Sea basin, which I would say challenges not only Ukrainian interests, but also those of Bulgaria, Romania, and Turkey, which are NATO members and which also have their territorial waters obviously in the Black Sea. And that's, I believe, one of the things we have to deal with, apart from the grain deal, also this deoccupation of the Black Sea. But then another thing is attacks on energy infrastructure, which will probably come as we're approaching winter. Because last year, for example, since I'm based in Odessa, there were these major attacks on energy infrastructure, blackouts, and that's another problem to deal with, which brings me to the point what Ukraine is expecting now, and that's boosting of its air defense. Anti-ship, anti-missile, and air defense capabilities are crucial for grain exports, for economy of Ukraine, because we cannot talk of reconstruction, for example, recovery of Ukraine, any kind of investments in Ukraine, if we don't have enough of these capabilities to protect what we're trying to rebuild. And probably last point here, not to use too much of my time, is again, what we are seeing in Russia now is also kind of giving us some signs of very cautious optimism, in a way that this protracted war, it has its negative implications, not only for Ukraine, but also for Russia. So, for example, if we look at the Wagner Prigozhin mutiny just in recent weeks, that shows us the internal weaknesses of the Putin's regime and the split between Russian elites inside Russia. If we look at the economic situation of Russia, it's still carrying on, obviously, because there are many loopholes for sanctions regimes. So Russia still has this capacity to produce new weapons. Russia still has this capacity to go on with its trade and with many different countries, oil, gas, that all brings obviously benefits and revenues to the Russian budget. But at the same time, we were talking about these attacks on Odessa and generally on Ukraine. So just last year, Russia spent $22 billion for these missile and drone attacks on Ukraine. And at the same time, and that's Russian statistics, its budget was cut for $32 billion. And all those budget cuts were mainly on such spheres as science, digital economy, education, culture. So at some point, I don't believe, but I do hope that this will also trigger some questions in Russian society for how long they want to proceed with this war. So that's very briefly the current situation, with the ongoing counteroffensive, slow but sure, with obvious damage for Ukrainian economy and generally food security in the world, with these attacks on seaport infrastructure, and with Ukrainian society still something like 87-89% saying that they support the deoccupation efforts of Ukraine until we get back our lands and return our people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yevgeniya. You know, if you are dealing with an enemy like Russia, you must have an integrated and a comprehensive structure. And only one of them is military. I mean, like military, I think Ukraine must have an economic power, must have a political commitment and decisiveness. On the other hand, there's another fact that's really important. It does lean on two different things. The first one is continuous support of the West, the US and Europe. And on the other hand, the second dynamic, to what extent Russia is endurable, to what extent Russia can continue a war like this. If Russia, just try to mend exactly what is lost at the front, well, it's clear that this war will be a protracted one in terms of military. So we will see the dynamics. On the other hand, we must understand exactly what Russian thinking is, what Russians can do in future. And in the meantime, we must assess. So I want to give the floor to Professor Yiğit, because she studied a lot about Russia, and she was in Russia, and I think knows the culture better than us. And my question is, what do you take, especially if Russian political, military, or economic might or capacity is concerned to sustain such sort of war? Because there's another fact. Now, Russian Wagner, even though there was a sort of coup d'etat attempt, well, they are really active in Africa. And now we are discussing Sahel region of Africa, which is a bit prone to Russia, So that means it's really a bit complicated. So what do you, how do you assess it, Professor Yiğit?
Okay, thanks for this timely event. Thank you for your invitation. The war is now at a critical stage, and there are too many subjects to bring to table, and we need to talk more about the conflict in order to describe the problems and possible solutions more realistically, I believe. Well, about the Russian economy, let me tell you about Russian economy and military in that prolonged war. In terms of economy, the strength of Russian economy comes from, as you all know, from rich natural resources. But in the last 15-20 years, the market size of Russia is intensely grown, and also taking into account the huge border territory between Russia and China, Russia is in an advantageous position to increase trading activities. On the other hand, however, after the invasion of Ukraine, due to the sanctions, the macroeconomic stability of Russia is expected to decline. So because Russian economy depends 40% on hydrocarbon prices. So another problematic area is for Russia at this stage is demography. Russian demography is in a steady decline, and the war contributes a lot to that decline. And the government, Russian government, tries to take precautions to prevent the brain drain. But to succeed in that, Russia needs to make more investment on technology. However, there is this fact that Russia is highly dependent on foreign technology, actually. So despite all these negative aspects, Russian economy somehow could, for now, could survive from sanctions. So well, after sanctions, Russia have managed to sell all their energy products, their minerals, agricultural products through other countries at higher prices. And these products have ultimately reached their target destination in Europe anyway. And Russians saw that they could sell almost everything if they needed to whom? To China, and also to India, to a lesser extent, of course. By the way, China and India, these are enormous economies, and with over 1 billion people, each of them, and they want to do business with Russia. Therefore, I want to come to the point that the absence of European market has not turned to be a terrible experience for Russians as it was assumed in the West. Given all these facts, yes, Russian economy for now can find a way to cope with sanctions. However, we have to admit that it has entered into a recession. And the West hoped that this recession would cause a social discontent, a discontent that may cause to decline or to end off maybe President Putin's presidency. But instead, we see that Putin's approval rating jumped after the invasion of Ukraine. We have to put this fact also to the table. Coming to the military power, so we can compare the capacity of Russia's military power in terms of its military units and financial standing for logistics, actually. So Russia is in the second place in the world rank in terms of quantity of military units and financial standing, and we have United States, of course, in the first place, and China in the third place, and Ukraine is at the 15th place on the rank for now. So although Ukrainian army is stronger and better prepared than in 2014, Ukraine's military equipment and capacity cannot be compared with the size of Russian military today. Plus, what is the most important, Russia is at every opportunity emphasizing its nuclear power and threatening Ukraine with nuclear warheads at every opportunity. So, however, despite Russia's manpower and artillery advantage over Ukraine, there are still some limitations in Russian military capabilities. I mean, the misalignment between President Putin and his commanders, superior officials. So let me underline one fact. Many analysts today agree upon one thing. In this ongoing war, the balance of two things are highly important. The balance of manpower and the balance of artillery. In terms of manpower, Ukrainians are highly disadvantaged compared to Russians. And assuming that the main weapon of this battlefield is artillery, Russians are way more advantageous than Ukrainians. And military experts say that Ukrainians are running out of artillery. Western countries' ability to produce artillery is the most critical factor today for Ukraine. And as the war continues, Western countries most probably will not be able to produce enough artillery for Ukrainians. And what is more, Russians have huge stocks of artillery. So it is obvious that Russians have a significant advantage here. As Ukraine is running out of artillery, cluster bombs are given them to compensate this artillery. However, these cluster bombs cannot help Ukraine to defeat Russians on the battlefield. So we all know that the most important thing is artillery. So there have to be found another solution. So this cannot be durable. So I believe that the miscalculation of the West was that a prolonged war will eventually put Russia in financial and military trouble and lead to the fall of the Putin's presidency. But from the great power politics perspective, you wouldn't scare or humiliate a great power such as Russia, because the results of it would be disastrous, actually, and Russia may follow risky strategies. So we have to underline the miscalculations of the West, and also Russia had also some miscalculations on the road. If my time allows, I can continue, or I don't know. Okay, so Russia also had some miscalculations, especially on the military process. We are talking about this misalignment between President Putin and his commanders. In the very beginning of the war, Putin wanted to demilitarize Donbas region, but he said that he doesn't want unnecessary casualties on the Ukrainian side at the very beginning, I mean. So he entered with a small unit. Then he encountered a great deal of resistance from high officials. He actually, what was in mind of Putin, he actually had hoped that Ukraine would negotiate after the first attempt of invasion. But most importantly, when he met with Ukrainians for negotiation, he discovered that there's no willingness to reach an agreement on the Ukrainian side. And this is, by the way, totally understandable from the Ukrainian side. From national interest perspective of Ukraine, this is totally understandable, totally fair. So by the summer, he has a meeting with all his senior officers, and they said that they wanted to go in hard, but Putin told them to go in soft. So they wanted more troops, but Putin didn't want it. So these officials in the current condition wanted Putin to change the strategy, actually, and to build a more decisive force. So only this way they believe that they can consolidate their control over the territories they invaded, which makes 23% of Ukrainian territory for now, I guess. So at the same time, in Wagner mutiny, we observed that there was a certain amount of unrest in the senior ranks of Russian military, because a lot of senior officers want to attack and end this war. So there was obvious a misalignment between Putin and his commanders. And Putin's last decision proves also this, actually. Yesterday, the Duma Defense Committee stated that Vladimir Putin is forming a network of private military companies across Russia to prevent another Wagner uprising. And these militias would be also under the command of regional governments who operate under Putin's command, and they would be armed only by the Russian Ministry of Defense. So this misalignment between Putin and his commanders can be seen also from that decision, from that governmental decision. Okay, if you look at from Russian perspective to the issue, yes, Ukraine has always been stuck between West and Russia, and it has a very hard place historically, and also geographically, Ukraine has always been in Russia's orbit. But in the last 20 years, many of Ukrainian politicians lobbied to NATO. And going back to 2008 at Bucharest summit, President George W. Bush said that Ukraine and Georgia should be part of NATO, and that set off alarm bells in Russia, actually. And even in 2008, some analysts stated that United States started the worst scenario for these two countries, because by declaring Ukraine and Georgia future NATO members, but not giving them a roadmap or a timetable, US both encouraged these countries against Russia and triggered Russian invasion to them. So actually, there's an illusion here. Eastern European countries believe that the best way to guarantee that Russia will not attack Ukraine again is to bring Ukraine within NATO membership only soon after the war. However, bringing Ukraine into NATO would be an open invitation to Putin to escalate the tension to the most fearful scenario, I believe. And I think if we listen to President Biden's assumptions on Putin, we would be making a big mistake. Nearly 2 weeks ago, President Biden said that there is no real prospect of Putin using nuclear weapons. However, on March of this year, Deputy Foreign Minister Galuzin underlined once again the red line of Russia. He said that Russia won't tolerate the existence of an openly anti-Russian state on their borders. So the most vital issue here is that from a Russian point of view, there is nothing more important than making sure that Ukraine is not in NATO. But the more the West promised to bring Ukraine into NATO, the greater the incentive for Russians to attack Ukraine. And the ultimate result of this is that Ukraine is going to be turned into a dysfunctional state at the end. So Ukrainians want a security guarantee, which is completely understandable. We cannot blame Ukrainians for looking for a security guarantee from the West. But I am afraid that before this security guarantee comes from the West, Ukraine will turn to be a dysfunctional state. So both sides, because Russians on one side and Ukraine and West on the other side, they view each other as existential threats that have to be defeated. And in such a situation, in such a world, there is very little room for negotiation. Maybe we can hope of a frozen conflict at least. Okay. So that would be my last point. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Professor. As you may know, this is a war, even though Russians do not call it as war, as special operations, and there will be many intervening actors. There will be really tremendous number of factors, and each party, even combatant or not, doesn't matter. Well, they will have differing perspectives, and I think Professor Aslı built up a Russian perspective regarding this war, with an empathy, by the way. And we have to understand Europe and the American side, the USA. Why? Because even if this war can be labeled as a protracted one, maybe not this year, but next, I don't know. Well, we have to be aware of the Western interests, because I know from the conferences and academic activities that there was a pattern in Eastern European thinking that Russians were still a threat to their existence. And Ukraine war clearly proved that, yes, Russians may become a threat and violate the sovereignty of the other states if their interests require. That's a fact. And I see that, well, they were right. For instance, when I participated to the events of the strategy center in Romania, I heard a lot of interpretation, a lot of, competing ideas that Russians must stop. It was even prior to Ukraine war. So I want to ask Professor Antonia, to what extent Europe and US wants to sustain this support to Ukraine, because it's the basic parameter that Ukraine can resist China. Because once Europe starts having a dispute in either supporting Ukraine or having a new sort of negotiation option with Russians, etc., well, this war either will be a protracted one, or they will tell Ukraine that, okay, stop, that's enough. So how do you see the perspectives of Europeans and the United States? Thank you.
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this very interesting discussion. And indeed, it was very interesting to hear an Ukrainian and a Russian perspective from a Turkish academic so far. On your question, I think that we very much have a two-layered conflict. And I will call it conflict because one layer is the economic layer. So we have the military war in Ukraine, obviously, the kinetic warfare in Ukraine. And I would say that currently we also have the kinetic warfare in the Black Sea proper. And an economic warfare, so an economic layer that goes beyond economic warfare through the effect of sanctions on the outside world. Now, we know that the moment that Russia imposed the blockade in the very first weeks of the war in 2022, we were basically looking at the effect on the markets, and we were wondering about all kinds of elements that will make our life harder in the sense of increasing inflation, increasing the cost of living, making it harder for us to get supplies from Russia and from Ukraine, obviously, while also thinking about what happens in Ukraine and whether that is a local, a regional element in Europe, or that is a wider strategy of Russia to engage the West based on its own national interest and based on its own national fears, if you like. So in taking an objective look and trying to balance off, I would say that we are currently 1 year on, 1 year and several months on, in the very same or in a very similar position, where we have a renewed blockade in the Black Sea. We have the Black Sea with a heightened risk of war. In insurance language, that means like the highest end of risk when it comes to trade and investment, making the war into the economic side of things, making the war effects very harsh for Europeans, but also, I would say, for Russians, because Russians, too, cannot use the Black Sea as they used it before. And I would also add that because of this blockade, the package that we are looking at from the West to support the war in Ukraine, a war that it sees effectively a war of its own, even. So there are many analysts in the US that would say this is an American war, even, because Russia is engaging against the US interests and against the international system as the US designed it after the World War II. And there are obviously also a lot of voices in Europe that are saying, well, this is also an European war, because obviously, again, it is against the European interest of keeping Europe safe and so on. But with this new blockade, we are no longer speaking just about support for the war, for the military war in Ukraine. Right now, we are looking at the security guarantees with some different eye lenses, because we are looking at the ways that the renewed discussions on security guarantees for Ukraine, renewed discussions that were announced, I think, yesterday between the US and Ukraine, are coming at this particular moment. And they are meant to send a signal to Russia, and also to send a signal to Russian allies. So they are beyond the scope of just what do we do for Ukraine proper, but it gets into the diplomatic language of how do others interpret what we do for Ukraine proper, which is another level of engagement of the US. Also, we have seen during the last week the passage of the Black Sea Act in the Senate, and we are looking to see if that is basically going to become a foundational piece of the NDAA, which is basically saying that the Black Sea becomes a very important spot for the US strategy, military strategy, and defense strategy, as that piece is integrated in the US defense budget. And that basically has the potential to shift a bit the balance of power in the Black Sea area by getting Western engagement into the military side of things beyond what we have seen it so far. So we all know that the Black Sea is pretty much a closed sea, because we don't have international waters in the Black Sea, and we have been proud of even of having that effect, because we, the coast countries, can manage the flow of things. Now, however, NATO is becoming more active, and by NATO, I particularly say Turkey is becoming more active. Turkey has been from the very beginning, I would underline, very much active, at least on the economic side of things, to make sure that the flow of merchandise, grain in particular, is being supported and is being done. However, we are seeing a lot more worries coming from the NATO coastal countries. Romania as well, obviously, is way more worried, because we have seen the very first attacks on internal ports for Ukraine, right on the borderline with Romania, a key spot for transiting for the grain shipments that are coming through land. So all of this coupled are basically adding to one conclusion. The NATO coastal sea, Black Sea countries are demanding for more US engagement, and the US is kind of pushed to give it. Now, with that in mind, referring to the European side of things, and indeed, you pointed out very right in your question already, the main risk of failing support for Ukraine is actually this fragility of the European Union, the fragility of the Western economic system, and the fragility of the political system in Europe. So basically, we are looking at a very interesting year, 2024. We are seeing the US engagement coming up. But we are also looking into an electoral year in the US and in Europe, which basically means that Europeans are going to be the target of campaigning, and Europeans are going to think about economic problems. And with economic problems comes the question of how does this situation actually add up to Europe being able to support the war in Ukraine by adding funding. So Europe so far sent and budgeted, I think, 1 billion euros for the solidarity lanes. However, that pretty much went to the customs and to the legal side of things, because new infrastructure cannot be built overnight. So what we need is basically investing in renewed infrastructure and making the current infrastructure allow more transit for Ukrainian merchandise. That likely will end up being a lot more money from the European side and from the American side. So the question mark is, will the European citizen see this as an investment into their future by allowing Ukraine to get closer to Europe, at least in trade and investment? Or will the Europeans see this as a waste of money? And the question is very much political. The question is very much dependent on how we portray the situation in we as, you know, journalists, media, analysts, the common voice of commentator. And it is very much dependent on how the war is being fought in Ukraine proper. And this I will turn to my previous speakers. We were looking at a counteroffensive indeed that we kind of hoped or considered to be a lot faster. We were looking at war fatigue in Russia. Both seem not to be fully correct. As it happens in wartime, appreciation of what is next is likely going to be wronged by the activities on the ground. So currently we have a situation where the war is ongoing, and even Russia looks to be more solid in the sense of engaging more in Ukraine and hitting infrastructure, basically with the strategic target of making Ukraine not able to sustain itself for long term. So basically getting away from its economic lifeline, because if you cut down the ports, you basically cut down the ability of Ukraine to ship merchandise. And that will be for longer term, considering port infrastructure is hit. And we are also looking on this other side of things where, okay, so that is going on. The war is not necessarily advancing on the ground, not in the sense of Russia being pushed back. And our main question in Europe is, do we actually have the money? And if we do have the money, do we invest the money or do we waste the money? And obviously, the strategic answer to that is we are investing that, because if it's a European war that is being fought, if it's a war that is being fought against the West, we are investing the money. However, it is basically up to what happens next in the field to tell us what comes next. And obviously, with the US engagement, it is the perception that Russia has towards what goes on in the Black Sea and how we collectively come together. And I may underline how we collectively, Turkey, Romania, Bulgaria, come together as NATO allies within the Black Sea area to basically support one another, because it's not only about supporting Ukraine, but it is also about supporting one another in maintaining a peaceful sea. And with that, I'm going to end here because I think the time is up. And I will be glad to take more questions in the next minutes as we go into discussion mode.
Thank you, Antonia. It's really complicated. We heard three different voices from three different countries, and interpretations differs because it's normal. On the other hand, we have to understand the basics and dynamics of the Black Sea. As you have mentioned, Antonia, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Romania, they are all NATO allies. And NATO, Turkey continues to support the membership of Ukraine to NATO since 2018. No, 14 actually. No, 2008. Sorry, 2008.
2008, yes.
Yes, 2008. And it didn't happen. That's a fact. On the other hand, Black Sea, the sea that we all share, Ukraine, Romania, Russia, Bulgaria, and Turkey, well, it does have a meaning. The Grain Corridor was a sort of hope to run the desired mechanisms in the Black Sea, at least to facilitate a humanitarian corridor for the deprived people in underdeveloped countries. But it has been ended. Russians claim that their expectations are not met per the signed protocols. On the other hand, it does have an impact, especially in the countries suffering from food or fertilizers, etc. So we have to understand not only the Grain Corridor, but wider Black Sea region in order to understand what sort of projection could be generated for this region. And I think Professor Yücel is the best scholar to answer this question, because his studies are either on delimiting the maritime zones or status quo in the Black Sea or Mediterranean Sea. So, Professor, let's have your opinion regarding this issue.
Thank you, Murat, Aslan. First of all, I am quite sorry that I have joined a little bit late, but I have been lucky enough to catch most of the comments that our participants have made so far. Yes, as Murat says, I'm going to concentrate on the so-called Grain Corridor Agreement that has been signed in 2022 last year, but we have some serious problems at the moment in terms of applying this deal at the moment. You know, the war is about 1.5 years, and it's quite you know, disappointing that it's still going on and creating many problems for humanity as a whole, and also the people of Ukraine and also people of Russia. You know, when the war started, when Russia attacked on Ukraine in 2022 early, you know, there were some crises created by the war and also some potential crises. The first points concerned the energy shortages globally, and especially in European countries, and also a food crisis for all countries, especially the poorer countries. So these two issues have been quite serious, simply because, you know, especially food is concerned, since Russia and Ukraine plays a very significant role in terms of producing and exporting the food products to the world, and any cut of export of food from these two countries has a very serious effect initially on poorer countries. That's why, you know, there have been some efforts from certain countries and United Nations to, you know, establish a safe corridors for export of the food products, especially from Ukraine. Turkey and United Nations have, especially the Secretary of United Nations and President of Turkey, President Erdogan, played a very significant role. We learned at that time that Turkey is using its connection with Russia, with dialogue with Russia, not only to satisfy the interests of Turkey, but also to satisfy the interests of international community as a whole. And it actually, you know, we learned at that time that especially countries with low income would be affected quite seriously. Hunger would be a problem in these countries, although especially these countries, poorer countries, have been already having difficulties in you know, proper food. Then this war would affect them even worse. So that's why these efforts have been quite valuable. Eventually, and luckily, you know, in 2022, an agreement have been achieved between four sides, between Russia, Ukraine, United Nations, and Turkey. There were two agreements because Russia and Ukraine did not come together in a single agreement. So that's why two separate agreements have been signed with these two countries. But the content of these agreements were the same. So far, since this agreement was done only for 4 months, then towards the end of the expire of this treaty, the effort started again to renew the treaty. So far, 3 times this agreement have been extended. But eventually, last month, Russia, on 17th July, Russia decided to pull out of the agreement, withdraw from the agreement, and we now, with the result of, having no agreement protecting the safe passage of the ships in the Black Sea carrying food products or fertilizers, then the world is again facing another potential crisis at the moment that the world faced at the very beginning of the war. So this corridor agreement, safe corridor agreement, is now expired completely with the withdrawal of Russia. There are, of course, some efforts to renew this. But let me briefly summarize what happened when the treaty was signed first, then what happened when this agreement was extended 3 times. Then I will concentrate at the last part. I will concentrate what are the reasons for Russia to withdraw from this agreement? Are they really justified reasons? And what could be the future of this agreement? The purpose of the agreement is explained with these words. It says that it's to facilitate safe navigation for the export of grain and related foodstuff and fertilizers, including ammonia, from the ports of Odessa, Chernomorsk, and Yuzhny. So it's naming three ports of Ukraine, and it's actually done to facilitate the export of food products and fertilizers through these ports of Ukraine. That's the main purpose. At the same time, United Nations and Russia signed a memorandum of understanding. I mean, apart from these 2 agreements, UN Secretary General and Russia signed an agreement, which is called the Memorandum of Understanding, in order to facilitate the export of Russian food products and fertilizers. So with this Memorandum of Understanding, Secretary General put himself in a position to negotiate with other countries, especially Western countries, including the United States, in order to facilitate Russian food exports and fertilizers exports. So this was a separate Memorandum of Understanding signed at the same time between Russia and United Nations Secretary General. Towards the end of the agreement in November last year, renewed efforts have been done to extend. Even at that time, Russia complained about certain developments. First of all, Russia in general terms said that it was not able to export its own food products and fertilizers. The second reason for Russia to hesitate the extent of the agreement was the food is not going to poorer countries. It's going to rich countries. That's the argument of Russia. But, thanks to the efforts by Turkey and United Nations, again, the agreement was extended for another 4 months and extended another 2 months and another 2 months until last year's 17th of June. So, but at the very beginning, at the very end of the extension of this agreement last month, Russia decided to pull out completely from the agreement. When Russia pulled out from the agreement, it also pulled out from the Joint Coordination Center in Istanbul, and also ended the guarantee for the safe passage of the ships. That means Russia is not guaranteeing any safe passage of these ships through Black Sea And we understand that there is no Russian, guarantee, so the ships are not safe anymore. So that's the situation, unfortunately. What are the real and concrete justifications of Russia? First of all, in the official statement which was made by Russia on 17 July, when Russia pulled out from the agreement, we have seen that Russia officially named some and certain justifications, concrete justifications for its withdrawal. It's first of all says, it's actually accusing some Western countries, which are, the United States, European Union, and especially United Kingdom, for applying some extra sanctions rather than facilitating the existing sanctions. And in the official statement, it says that these countries introduced 5 new sanctions on Russia after the agreement was signed. Another accusation by Russia is that it's not even selling agricultural machinery to Russia, arguing that these are dual-purpose machines, could be used militarily. So Russia is simply saying that it's not able to purchase agricultural machinery or parts, spare parts for this. So that's why it's losing its ability to, produce enough agricultural products. Another accusation is export of fertilizers. Russia says that it has been only export very limited amount of fertilizers to Latvia, Estonia, Belgium, and Netherlands. It was just happened for a very short time in September 2021. Apart from this, Russia was not able to sell any fertilizers to any country because of the sanctions of Western countries. Another accusation by Russia is that its Bank of Agriculture, Russian Bank of Agriculture, is not able to use SWIFT transfer system. So that means it's not able to get any payment from other countries because the Russian Bank of Agriculture is not connected to, although its demand was this, but it's not connected to the SWIFT system. And lastly, a pipeline carrying ammonia from Russia to Ukrainian port of Odessa was sabotaged by a bomb, so it's not repaired again, so it's not able to use this pipeline anymore. These are the accusations concerning the sanctions. And the last accusation by Russia is that it's the food from Ukraine is not going to poorer countries. According to Russia, it says that 70% of the food so far exported from Ukraine went to the rich countries. And it argues that certain Western, food companies are actually playing the major role in exporting their Ukrainian products. Actually, it named some companies like Cargill, DuPont, and Monsanto. These are the names that mentioned by Russia. And according to Russia, these companies, Western food companies, are playing the major role in purchasing these foods from Ukraine rather than the poorer countries. If we look at the figures published by Joint Coordination Center, that's true that, mostly, only 3% of all food export, which is around 33 million tons so far, 3% went to the lower wage countries, very limited amount, 3%. Others went to the rich countries or medium countries, medium income countries, or just over this medium income countries. So whether they are justified is another issue. First of all, concerning these sanctions, that's right. Western countries are trying to impose very strong sanctions on Russia. But I think there is a part that Western countries should play to facilitate the export of Russian food and fertilizers. But on the other hand, Russia is using this, as a reason, as a justification to withdraw from the deal. What Russia is trying to do is that use the food corridor agreement to get rid of most of the sanctions. That's the role that Russia is trying to put on this deal. I think it's just an exaggeration. Of course, we know that the Western countries could do more to facilitate, especially the effect of the sanctions on the agricultural products, on fertilizers. The second point is that, is it a problem that the food is going to rich countries rather than the poorer countries? I think the aim of the deal is not to send the food to the poorer countries. If we look at the purpose statement in the agreement, it just says that the agreement is done to facilitate the export of the Ukrainian and Russian food products rather than taking these food to send the poorer countries. And also United Nations agencies purchasing the food to send them to the poorer countries free has actually increased to the 80%. United Nations purchase for the poorer countries increased to the 8%. It was about 60% before the war, but it increased to 80%, for the poorer countries. As United Nations General Secretary said that since rich countries are able to get this food, then the price of the food is stabilized in the world, and it positively affects the poorer countries. And also, the food is also going to poorer countries, which is the name of the poorer countries, I'm not going to mention them, is around 6 countries we are talking about, and 3% went to these countries. As far as these countries are able to get this food and are able to see the stabilized prices globally, then I think it's a favor again to the poorer countries concerning the food products. The last point, what can we do to, guarantee the safety of the food products export from the Black Sea? I think there are many scenarios are under discussion at the moment. Ukraine sometimes said that it's going to use the ports in the river Danube to export to the European countries and to the world through this channel. I'm not sure whether it's really feasible technically. Another proposal from Ukraine is that let's establish an international military force as against Russia to protect the ships in the Black Sea from the Ukrainian ports. And again, I'm not sure that it's really possible to establish such an international military force in the Black Sea as against Russia. And other scenarios are actually named by Russia. Russia says that actually Russia is not helping at all anymore. It's rather threatening any ships going into the Black Sea or coming from the Black Sea. And we have seen that Russia is doing some military maneuvers to attack on such ships. It's a problem. So that means that Russia is going to not to allow any ships without its permission carrying any food from Ukrainian ports. I think the last point, we should do whatever is necessary to renew this agreement, including the Russian participation. As United States Foreign Minister said, Turkey should play more role to get Russia into the agreement again. And United States Secretary General is doing a lot of efforts to persuade Russia into this agreement again. I think that's the best solution in my perception. But now, at the moment, Turkey and United States is doing a lot of efforts to renew the agreement. We just hope that it will do, because we are expecting another food crisis at the moment if this agreement is not renewed. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Professor. And let me remind one another thing. We are entering to a phase of global warming. So agricultural products will have utmost importance for the survivability of not human, but humanity. So it's really an important issue, I believe, not only the Grain Corridor, but resolving this war for the sake of underdeveloped countries. I want to ask one single question to two speakers and two questions to the rest of the speakers, and then we'll conclude it. I kindly request you to finish your speech in not more than 3 minutes because we don't have time. I wonder what sort of least terms of conditions must be observed for a fair peace. So my question in this sphere goes to first Dr. Yevgeniya Gaber and then Professor Aslı. What could be the least terms for a fair peace? I think we must understand it. And then we can go to Antonia. Well, all countries in the West applied some sort of sanctions on Russia. There are some critiques to Turkey that Turkey did not participate to these applications. On the other hand, Turkey has excused because of the long history of sanctions on significant countries directly neighboring Turkey and the consequences or impacts of this practice. And we have to understand if it's successful or not, or what could be more or less. And finally, I would like to ask Professor Yücel Acer, Montreux. Well, Montreux clearly guarantees the safe passage of vessels for trade. And right after terminating this agreement, there will be some attempts maybe reaching out the ports of Ukraine, even though there are disputes if Western states should provide an aerial cap or not. But what should be the situation of Turkey? Because if this is a war, well, it does have a status quo. Russia does not call this conflict as a war, as a special operation. This is another thing. So to what extent Russia can prevent the access of third parties to the ports of Ukraine? This is another issue. So how do you assess Montreux and maritime traffic trying to reach out Ukraine ports? So please, 3 minutes each, and let's start with Yevgeniya.
Thank you very much. I might use another minute because I was short in the very beginning, but I do want to address some of the issues mentioned before. So just facts, it's not my assessment, just facts. First about the situation on the ground, and I want to refer to a couple of words from Professor Yiğit. Actually, Ukraine is not doing that bad on the battlefield. And to claim that Ukraine is running out of artillery, whereas Russia is doing great, I think is a bit of maybe not correct assessment, because if you look at the different assessments of think tanks, of War Institute, it said that actually the ratio between the Ukrainian artillery and tanks and the Russian ones now is much better than it used to be in the first days of the war. Because on the one hand, Ukraine gets a lot of arms supplies, whereas Russia is running out of what they have. And then we have to look at the quality, right? So Russia is trying to bring Soviet-era tanks, sometimes museum samples to the battlefield, where Ukraine is using Leopards and all different versions of NATO tanks, artillery, weapons. I'm not going into details. So it's also about the efficiency of use. And now it's 1 to 4, the level of destroy when Ukraine destroys 4 howitzers, for example, where it's only 1 in Ukraine is destroyed. So I don't think it's that bad. Now what Ukraine is doing with Western partners is talking about this joint production and planning in long-term production of arms in case we have this protracted war with Russia. Then again, the same goes for the manpower. It's not only the quantity, but the quality. And I don't go into details here as well. I think that it's clear that Ukrainian soldiers are much more motivated. The morale is much higher, and they are very well trained by our Western partners, whereas in Russian case, very often you just have some guys taken from jail, some Wagner, some private companies who don't even know what their commanders are doing, and who are very often this kind of Soviet type command, which is completely inefficient and ineffective. Cluster bombs, we were supplied by cluster bombs not because we don't have artillery, but because actually the Russian side were using them even before against Ukrainian civilians, where there is very limited scope of use of the cluster bombs on the battlefield, just to make this advancing on the battlefield faster. And again, let me just remind you how Russia has been using that in Bakhmut, in Avdiivka, and other regions of Ukraine against civilians. NATO triggered Russian aggression. I think this is one of the main narratives that Russia is generally pushing for, and I appreciate that you mentioned it because you were presenting kind of a Russian position here. But with Turkey being NATO member and with Turkey supporting Bucharest summit declaration, with President Erdogan being very clear on backing Ukraine's membership in NATO, I don't think that Turkey triggers Russian aggression or that Turkey is anti-Russian. That is just about a country's decision to be part of the bloc, to be part of the alliance. And now we have up to 8% of Ukrainian citizens who vote for the membership in NATO, so it's not up to Russia to decide. On the other hand, let me remind you that in 2007, we had this Munich speech by President Putin before 2008 Bucharest memorandum, when actually we had these first signs of hybrid aggression and of this new strategy preparation of warfare against many of countries like Georgia, Ukraine, and others. So I would say that, just to cut it very short, to quote George Kennan, I think, who said that Russia can only see its neighbors either as vassals or as enemies. So when you deny to be a vassal, you automatically become an enemy. And that's unfortunately how it works with Russia. And then last point on the grain deal, and there is a lot to say there, but I won't because I don't have time for that. Actually, if you look at the United Nations statistics, 65% of the grain goes to the developing countries. Maybe there is 3% about some particular countries, but 65% of all grain shipped within the grain corridors, it goes to the developing countries. And if you look at the wheat, for example, then the percentage would be a bit different. But again, it's 2/3 of the whole shipments going to the developing countries. Then if you look at the statistics of Russian side, in 2022, grain cargo turnover in Russian seaports increased by more than 6% compared to the previous year. And mineral fertilizers turnover rose to 25% just last year. So we don't speak about decrease of exports in Russia, we speak about increase of fertilizers and grain exports from Russia, despite what they are saying. And on the other hand, we have major looting of Ukrainian grain in the occupied territories by the Russian side. We have major attacks on infrastructure in Ukraine, agricultural and seaports. So we have clear acts of war crimes and acts of aggression. And that brings me to the point of my list of this just end to this war. I think that the list is very clear, and it has been made clear by the Ukrainian side several times. First, we need to deoccupy our territories, including Crimea, and that the only option to save not only Ukrainian territorial integrity, but also international rules-based world order. We're talking about attack on a sovereign state, so deoccupation is important. Return of all Ukrainian citizens, kidnapped Ukrainian children, prisoners of war, political prisoners, return of them to Ukraine, and justice. And justice means also international tribunal for war criminals in Russia. That might look now a bit of this illusion or a tale, fairy tale, but we have to think about this, because this is also how we create precedents for the future. My very last point here is cooperation between Western partners, NATO, coastal countries as well, Turkey, Romania, Bulgaria, Ukraine, because what we are seeing now is how Russia dictates and imposes its conditions in the Black Sea. Given that Turkey is a regional power with global ambitions, I do believe that Turkey has a much bigger role to play here rather than just talk about red lines of Russia and buying Russian blackmailing with nuclear weapons and, you know, this Black Sea blockade that we are witnessing now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Yevgeniya. And Professor Aslı, what could be the least terms for Russians? Please build an empathy.
Oh, right. So the least terms of a peace, so the war could only be ended, or the least terms of a peace could be set, of course, if Russia withdrew its troops from Ukraine and if Russia stopped the bombing. That's sure, but this would mean the most humiliating scenario for Russia, and I don't expect that would happen, actually. And for a fair peace, we have to resolve two issues, I believe, and let me refer to the famous American political scientist Mersheimer, who stated very well that there are two key issues that are unresolvable at that war. And without resolving these two issues, it is almost impossible to find a peaceful solution. The first has to do with territory, and the second has to do with neutrality. And Russians insist that Ukraine should not be in NATO. However, Ukrainians, fairly enough, they want to be in NATO. And about the issue of territory, the fact is that Russians have taken about almost 23% of Ukrainian territory, and Russians determined to not giving it back. And Ukrainians, understandably, they want all of their territory back. So looking at these two matters, territorial and neutrality issues, we conclude that two sides, as I said earlier, approach each other as existential threats. So I don't see peaceful solutions, unfortunately. And it is hard to get a genuine peace agreement. Instead, I think it is going to end up at best in a frozen conflict. So again, from Russian perspective, their ultimate aim, Russia's ultimate aim is, they say that they don't want to invade the whole Eastern Europe, as it has been claimed by European countries and the United States. Putin actually claims that he wants to do business with everybody. Because for Russian further development and growth, he needs technology. Russia needs technology, especially they need German technology, by the way. So Germany is and has always been an extremely important country for Russia. And now Putin is trying to substitute Chinese, Indian, and other economic powers for German cooperation. And I believe the best solution would be a frozen conflict in order to immediately find a solution for civilian sufferings. And I know this is not a final solution, but at least it could protect civilians and also the infrastructure from being bombed. And with Russia's withdrawal from the grain agreement, it will not be safe to ship grain through Ukrainian ports, as Professor Acer also stated. By hitting the ports of Odessa, lastly, very recently, and targeting every civilian ships, Russia has shown that it will not allow Ukraine to export grain on its own. And in the future, Russia plans to turn Ukraine, I believe, into a country without no exit to Black Sea. And in this case, if Ukraine could ship over land through Romania, could export through land through Romania, but this would have a big impact on export costs. Although I don't have any hope for now, unfortunately, for the solution of the conflict in the near future, I hope that there would be found some solutions for the security of the grain corridor, actually, for the export of grain, either through land by helping Ukraine, by providing security to Ukraine, exporting through land, or finding any other solution. And I agree with Professor Acer that Turkey's mediation is still very important at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. As I see from the argument of both speakers, I think it's the military capacity that will define exactly the course of the war. And what I know from the Russian history, please, Aslı Hoca, Professor Aslı is an expert on Ottoman and Russian history. Russians will accept only military might, otherwise they will continue fighting. That's the fact. So the capacity of both countries will be the determinant dynamics in this. And once any of them does have hope to have a victory, that means this war will be a protracted one. That's another fact. So I will go to Professor Antonia about sanctions. There was a great discussion regarding sanctioning Russia. The West, Germany, France, well, there was a divided posture in Europe's attitude. So what's your recommendation? What's your interpretation on this?
So I'd like to start by saying that, first of all, sanctions were a response not to the military attack of Ukraine, but to the blockade that Russia put on Ukraine, which, of course, is part of a long-term strategy by Russia regarding the so-called failed state that you are very rightfully mentioning. That's probably the goal of Russia, to get back in power in Kiev and basically dominate Ukraine. That's the idea there. However, sanctions were a response. That said, sanctions are also an economic diplomatic tool. So it is part of the economic diplomacy toolkit, if you like. What do I mean by that? When someone imposes sanctions in the history of economic warfare, we do see a response. The first response is basically the country that is being under sanctions tries to get away from the sanctions, the so-called sanctions loopholes, okay? Which we do see in Russia through the parallel imports, through Russia trying to build new infrastructure, rebuild, reinstall old infrastructure that was there during the USSR and so on. Basically, to go away to the market that it used to be its own, and this is key to remember. Russia still wants the European market, Russia still wants the Western market, and Russia is still dependent very much on the Western market, because otherwise it wouldn't want to go there. It wouldn't want its merchandise to go there. And it said so. Another key element in Russian politics is that it usually says what it wants. And it actually publicized this in the foreign policy paper. The last version of the foreign policy strategy has this in there, and it actually says what states it will use to get the parallel imports going. That said, we are at the point where the sanctions they weren't failing. They basically started to bite, which is why one part of the grain deal failure refers to the inability of the West or Russia to negotiate the swift reconnection of the public bank in Russia, the agriculture bank in Russia. That says something about the Russian economy. It is doing well, but not so great. And the other side of thing is that Russia would either enter negotiations with the West on sanctions, which creates actually a moment of opportunity. So I know that it sounds kind of crazy right now when we are seeing everything failing in the Black Sea, to say that this is also a moment of opportunity for negotiation. Note that Russia has said it gives the West time until November, I think. So three more months. We don't know what this time is actually for in terms of military might, but we do know what this time is for in terms of economic negotiations, when it comes to economic diplomacy. And later on, at the other stage, Russia is going through the other alignments set, economic alignments set globally. And we have seen activity in the global south. We have seen activity in Africa in particular. I think that what happens now in Niger is not necessarily very much disconnected with what happens in the Black Sea and what happens in Ukraine. I believe that we could connect the dots as analysts to see the wider picture there. So we are living through a realignment that is going away from our region, but goes back into the region. What do I mean by that? The West first, the West did not impose the mightiest sanctions. Note that there are Western banks functioning in Russia. Note that there is Western merchandise going to Russia. So the West did not decouple. And unlike the wording that the Americans use when it comes to the Chinese, the wording for the economic linkages when it comes to Russia is not that tough, which tells us that there is room for negotiation. So I believe, and I am pretty much sure, that Turkey is going to have a role in the grain deal. And I also believe that it might be possible that Turkey might have a role in the upper layer negotiations when it comes to the economic diplomacy. And now, if I am to be the Romanian optimist in the room, I would say that I am hopeful for the war to end on the economic diplomacy side, at least. Obviously, it all depends on what happens on the ground, but at least we should have the Black Sea. And this is key, actually, for Ukraine's future, because Ukraine needs to have the ports back.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Thank you. And Professor Yücel, Montreux, safe passage of vessels, maritime freedom, because I remember the World War II, you know, the vessels hit by Germans. So how do you interpret it?
Thank you, Murat. I would try to be quite brief. You know, Turkey has been applying the Montreux Convention during this military conflict quite properly. First of all, I have to say that Montreux Convention is a multilateral international convention. That means all the sides, including Russia, have responsibilities to apply convention. It's not only Turkey to observe and apply the convention properly. It's also Russia and other, you know, party countries like United Kingdom and other Black Sea countries have a responsibility to apply and observe the Montreux Convention. Since Turkey has the sovereignty over the Turkish Straits, it's in a position sometimes when it is necessary to stop the ships and search, whether it's military or commercial. All the ships during this conflict, you know, are passing through the straits according to the rules of Montreux Convention. The warships of two countries, Ukraine and Russia, are not able to pass through the convention, pass through the Turkish states because of the Montreux Convention's restriction on that. Sometimes there was allegations, especially from the Ukrainian side, that you know, sometimes from the Russian side, that the ships are carrying the military equipments through the corridor through the Turkish Straits, and Turkey should stop them. But unfortunately, it's not only Turkey has the responsibility to prevent these ships passing through the Turkish Straits. You know, Turkey has done the necessary things to stop all the Russian ships passing through the Turkish Straits. That's the one side. The other side is that as far as the commercial ships, the Ukrainian side argued that the Russian ships are carrying the stolen crops from the Ukrainian side, and Turkey should stop them. As far as they are passing only through the Turkish Straits without calling on any port, Turkey has no authority to stop these ships, commercial ships. So that's why when one Russian ship came to the Turkish port, Turkey stopped that ship and searched it whether there was any stolen Ukrainian grain in the ship. So as far as the Montreux Convention is concerned, Montreux Convention is playing the necessary role to prevent the war coming to the Turkish Straits, and Turkey has been doing the necessary, measures to prevent any military conflicts coming to the Turkish straits. I think because of the Montreux Convention, we have no extended war in Black Sea, thanks to the Montreux Convention. Of course, we hope that the war would stop on the land as well, completely, and restore the sovereignty of Ukraine all over its own territory. But at least, thanks to the Montreux Convention and its proper application, we have not seen any major military conflict in the Black Sea.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I thank you all. If you ask me only one sentence as a conclusion to this panel, I would say, well, you may agree or not, there must be a reform in the UN system because there's a clear violation of peace directly committed by a member of United Nations Security Council, and we can't stop it. So if we discuss such sort of themes, well, we have to question the UN system because the essential responsibility on preserving peace is on United Nations Security Council. So we are in a position right now to assess the international politics, international system, because, well, we can discuss Ukraine, Russia, etc., Black Sea, but we have some events in Sahel region, concerns on Chinese efforts in the Chinese Sea. We call Chinese Sea, by the way, but you can call South Sea, etc. It's another issue. So let's see what will happen. I thank you a lot for your participation, and I thank audience because of their patience. It was a long discussion, 1 hour and 37 minutes, but I think it deserves. The topic is really hot. Thank you so much. Best wishes.